Chapter 4. The Murder Conspiracy. What motivated a group of Jewish religious leaders to conspire to kill Jesus? Why didn't they kill Jesus themselves instead of involving Roman authorities? Fear of insurgency. Jewish court proceedings shortly after Jesus' crucifixion give insight into what Jewish leaders thought about Jesus and his followers. Jesus' disciples, Peter and John, were arrested and warned by the Sanhedrin to stop preaching that Jesus was the Messiah and that he had risen from the dead. Peter and John refused to stop, however, Acts 4, verse 18. After being released, they again went to the temple to continue preaching. Peter and John were arrested a second time and again brought before the Sanhedrin, from Acts chapter 5. When they had brought them, they stood them before the council, and the high priest questioned them, saying, "We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name. Look, you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood on us." But Peter and the apostles replied, "We must obey God rather than people. The God of our forefathers raised up Jesus, whom you seized and killed by hanging him on a tree. God exalted him to his right hand as leader and Savior, to give repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sins. And we are witnesses of these events, and so is the Holy Spirit, whom God has given to those who obey him." Now when they heard this, they became furious and wanted to execute them. But a Pharisee, whose name was Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, who was respected by all the people, stood up in the council and ordered the men to be put outside for a short time. Then he said to the council, "Men of Israel, pay close attention to what you are about to do to these men. For some time ago Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed, and nothing came of it. After him Judas the Galilean arose in the days of the census, and incited people to follow him in revolt. He too was killed, and all who followed him were scattered. So in this case I say to you, stay away from these men and leave them alone, because if this plan or this undertaking originates with people, it will come to nothing. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop them, or you may even be found fighting against God." He convinced them, and they summoned the apostles and had them beaten. Then they ordered them not to speak in the name of Jesus and released them. Acts 5, 27-40. Gamaliel was a highly revered Pharisee, doctor of the law, and president of the Sanhedrin. He is mentioned twice in the New Testament, first at the above-noted hearing of Peter and John before the Jewish high court, the Sanhedrin. Secondly, the Apostle Paul identified Gamaliel as his mentor when Paul himself was training to become a Pharisee. As a young Pharisee, Paul severely persecuted Christians to the point of death, Acts 9, 1-3. Gamaliel may not have shared Paul's prior intense hatred for Christians, but we must assume he had no sympathy for them either. Gamaliel's comments about Peter and John are telling. To Gamaliel, Jesus and his followers were comparable to two prior political insurgent groups. Judas of Galilee, as discussed previously in chapter 3, was a zealot who led armed resistance against Rome. Little is known about Judas other than he died and his movement dissolved. Gamaliel's comments suggest Judas died at the hands of the Romans. Theudas, according to Gamaliel, also led an uprising, but he was killed and his followers dispersed. The insurgent groups of both Judas of Galilee and Theudas dissipated after the deaths of their leaders. Jesus' religious movement was ostensibly decapitated by his crucifixion. Gamaliel's expectation was that his followers would dissipate and that Jesus' movement would no longer exist. However, he did voice the disclaimer that if perhaps Jesus' movement was from God, there was no point in fighting against it. Gamaliel was thus able to quell the anger of the Sanhedrin members who wanted to kill Peter and John. Gamaliel's words carried a great deal of weight within the Sanhedrin. Gamaliel gives us historical commentary of what Jewish leaders thought about Jesus and his disciples. Jewish leaders knew the Romans would deal with any perceived insurgent group as they had with others, with lethal force. We can surmise the Sanhedrin feared that Jesus' growing popularity might look like a rising insurgent movement and invite the wrath of the Roman military. The Sanhedrin's fears of Roman military intervention were relieved by Jesus' crucifixion. They expected killing Jesus would disband his followers and end his religious movement. Joseph Caiaphas, chief antagonist. Caiaphas married the daughter of Annas, the high priest prior to Caiaphas. He would have been a person of wealth and high social position to be able to do so. Caiaphas was appointed high priest by Valerius Gratus, the Roman prefect of Judea before Pontius Pilate. Caiaphas must have been adept at political maneuvering. He was retained as high priest when Pontius Pilate succeeded Valerius Gratus as prefect of the region and was the longest-serving high priest in the 1st century, from 18 to 37 A.D. He was succeeded by his brother-in-law Jonathan, a son of Annas. Caiaphas and the family of Annas represented a Jewish religious political dynasty. As a Sadducee, Caiaphas embraced a largely secular view of his position and aimed to protect a symbiotic relationship with Roman governors. What the Romans thought of Jesus' growing movement was a major concern to Caiaphas. He worried that Rome would perceive Jesus as the leader of a brewing insurrection and act in a punitive and overpowering way to disband the movement. Caiaphas feared Roman martial law and the loss of the temple in Jerusalem. Jesus' growing popularity and reports that he was performing miracles were points of discussion within the Sanhedrin. From John's Gospel, chapter 11. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called the council together and said, "What are we doing? For this man is performing many miraculous signs. If we allow him to go on in this way, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away our sanctuary and our nation." Then one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said, "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is more to your advantage to have one man die for the people than for the whole nation to perish." Now he did not say this on his own, but because he was high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the Jewish nation, and not for the Jewish nation only, but to gather together into one the children of God who are scattered. So from that day they planned together to kill him. John 11:47-53. Caiaphas makes a macabre prediction, quote, "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is more to your advantage to have one man die for the people than for the whole nation to perish," end quote. John 11:49-50. To Jesus' disciple John, Caiaphas' statement was an unintended double-meaning prophecy having spiritual significance. To John, Caiaphas made an unwitting prophecy that God's forgiveness would come to people of all nations through Jesus' crucifixion. In Caiaphas' mind, however, the death of Jesus would disband his movement. Caiaphas' social position and personal wealth depended on maintaining the political status quo. One thing is clear. Caiaphas' intention from that day forward was to have Jesus put to death. Some within the Sanhedrin colluded with him. Herod's temple, the cash prize. Herod's temple had a total area of 144,000 square meters, more than the size of 26 football fields. A wonder of the ancient world, it was Herod the Great's legacy to himself. More than just the center of Jewish culture and religious life, it was the national financial repository. The wealth of the nation had been stockpiled in the temple under the auspices of religion. The treasury also served as the national banking system and included the savings of widows and orphans. Tons in precious metal holdings were contained in the temple and its treasury. A reference in the Dead Sea Scrolls named the precious metal holdings at 4,500 talents, possibly equaling as much as 100,000 kilograms. Temple assets would have represented billions of U.S. dollars in modern purchasing power. The significance of the temple as a place of worship became eclipsed by the precious metal holdings within the temple. This angered Jesus. He chided the Pharisees. Jesus said, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, 'Whoever swears by the temple is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is bound by the oath.' Blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred?" End quote. Matthew 23:16-17. In addition to precious metal holdings, transactions occurring in the temple generated enormous cash flow. The temple collected tax and served as a depository for monetary collections and religious donations from the general public. There was a money exchange business to convert foreign money to Israeli currency, which then enabled purchases from concessions within the temple itself. Millions of people visited the temple annually to worship in various rituals and festivals. Hundreds of thousands of animals were sacrificed each year, creating another source of revenue by selling the hides. It can be assumed that graft and corruption were present on many levels. Jesus was aware of the corruption within the temple, Luke 19, verse 46, Matthew 21, verse 13. At the head of all this were the chief priests, the Sanhedrin, and most importantly the high priest as the supreme religious leader. Those in authority benefited from temple business. Understandably, they would seek to preserve their social position and maintain the tenuous peace between Rome and Israel. To Caiaphas, the death of one man was a small concession in order to protect his personal wealth, political status, and avert Roman martial law. The monetary holdings of the temple were immense. If Rome impounded temple assets, it would be an enormous blow to Israeli patriotism, an irreparable financial injury to the nation. Stakes were high. Caiaphas's concerns that Rome would seize the temple were justified. His fears were later realized in 70 AD at the siege of Jerusalem. The Arch of Titus in Rome depicts a military parade bringing home the spoils of war, including treasure from the temple. Josephus stated that heaps of treasure were carried in the parade and that, quote, above all stood out those captured in the temple in Jerusalem, end quote. According to Josephus, gold taken from the temple glutted the market in Rome to the point that the market price of gold decreased by 50%. There is archaeological evidence that the spoils from the siege of Jerusalem helped finance the construction of the Colosseum in Rome in 72 AD. Originally named Amphitheatrum Flavium, the Colosseum is the largest amphitheater ever built and a wonder of the ancient world. The original dedication plaque of the Colosseum had bronze letters held in marble by pegs. The letters were later removed and overwritten with a carved inscription, the Lampadius inscription, after renovations in the 5th century. Phantom images of the original inscription have been deciphered and reconstructed, which read, quote, the Emperor Caesar, Vespasian Augustus, ordered the new amphitheater to be made from the proceeds from the sale of the booty, end quote. This must have referred to the spoils of war commemorated in the adjacent Arch of Titus, loot from the siege of Jerusalem chief among them. Jesus arrested. As much as religious leaders wanted to kill Jesus, they feared backlash from the general public. A cloak and dagger assassination would be difficult if not impossible. It was also important that the plot remained secret. Jesus was so popular that openly arresting him could cause rioting. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people met together in the palace of the high priest, who was named Caiaphas. They planned to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him, but they said, quote, not during the feast, so that there won't be a riot among the people, end quote. Matthew 26, 3-5. The chief priests were happy to bribe Judas Iscariot, one of Jesus' disciples, who agreed to take temple guards, the Sanhedrin's police, to a private meeting place frequented by Jesus and his disciples. Jesus could then be arrested without public knowledge. From Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, now the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching. The chief priests and the experts in the law were trying to find some way to execute Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, the one called Iscariot, who was one of the 12. He went away and discussed with the chief priests and officers of the temple guard how he might betray Jesus, handing him over to them. They were delighted and arranged to give him money. So Judas agreed and began looking for an opportunity to betray Jesus when no crowd was present. End quote. Luke 22, 1-6. The murder plot was set in motion. The events after Jesus' arrest are later described in detail in chapter 6, the execution of Jesus. Why didn't the Jews kill Jesus? The Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court, had lost capital authority by the time Jesus rose to public prominence. John 18, verse 31. Rome seems to have been reluctant to interfere with matters of religious disagreement. For example, Pilate gave the Jews permission to judge Jesus by Hebrew law, John 18, verse 31. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, was slain by an angry mob for his faith without record of Roman retribution, to Acts 7, 58-60. Rome seemed willing to look the other way when it came to religious conflicts among the Jews. Still, Rome maintained final and absolute control over judicial proceedings and capital punishment. It was problematic for the Jews to execute Jesus. A clear-cut conviction of capital crimes didn't seem possible due to a lack of credible witnesses, Matt 26:59-60. Secondly, they feared public backlash if they killed Jesus. Finally, an unauthorized trial and execution by the Sanhedrin was certain to attract the ire of Roman authorities. There was not an absolute impasse to the Jews executing Jesus themselves, however. Permission could be granted for the Sanhedrin to try Jesus by Hebrew law and execute him. Such permission was, in fact, granted. Pilate told the Jews, "Take him yourselves and pass judgment on him according to your own law." John 18, verse 31. Pilate further stated, "You take him and crucify him. Certainly I find no reason for an accusation against him." John 19, verse 6. Note, Jews did not use crucifixion as a form of execution. Pilate had granted authority to the Jews to try Jesus by Hebrew law and execute him. Clearing the way for the Sanhedrin to try and execute Jesus under Hebrew law did not make it any easier for the Sanhedrin. Jesus had a huge following. Thousands would come to listen to him speak. Many felt Jesus was the Messiah, the soon-to-be King of Israel, Luke 19:35-38, and John 6:14-15. Inciting mob unrest was an unacceptable risk, particularly during the heightened Roman military presence during the Passover festival. Furthermore, Roman permission to execute Jesus did not automatically mean Jesus could be executed from the standpoint of Hebrew law. Legal requirements for conviction of a capital crime were well defined in Hebrew law. Testimony was required from a minimum of 2, better 3, eyewitnesses of the capital offense, Deuteronomy 17, verse 6. Circumstantial evidence or testimony from a single eyewitness was not sufficient. The Sanhedrin had tried to gather testimony for capital charges against Jesus but were unsuccessful. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find anything. Many gave false testimony against him, but their testimony did not agree. Mark 14:55-56. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were trying to find false testimony against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find anything, though many false witnesses came forward. Matthew 26:59-60. Legitimate execution of Jesus through the Jewish court system did not seem possible. Even if trumped-up charges were possible, railroading Jesus through court proceedings with corrupt witnesses and executing him would cause public outrage. Roman execution of Jesus on charges of sedition was a much better option for Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin members colluding with him, engaging the Roman legal system. Pontius Pilate lived in Caesarea, a coastal harbor. The city was built by Herod the Great and named in honor of Caesar. It was a shipping center for the region, headquarters city for the Roman government and military, and the Roman capital in the province of Judea. Culturally and geographically, Caesarea was a preferred place to live compared to Jerusalem from the Roman point of view. Passover is the most observed Jewish holiday. In Jesus' time, an estimated 3 to 5 million people came to Jerusalem during Passover. Pilate came to Passover for a show of Roman strength and to openly discourage any thoughts of unrest. Roman presence in Jerusalem during Passover made for opportune timing to bring charges against Jesus before Pontius Pilate. Jesus and Pilate. Pilate had no interest in Jesus. His attempts to recuse himself from the case were rejected by Jewish religious leaders, however. They were unrelenting in their demand that Pilate try Jesus on charges of sedition, a capital crime. Jesus had been arrested, interrogated by Caiaphas, and beaten by Jewish leaders during the night without public knowledge. He was brought to Pilate early the following morning. The general public was seemingly unaware that Jesus had been arrested. Thus the crowd assembled before Pilate that morning was biased against Jesus. They had been influenced and, quote, stirred up, end quote, by the chief priests, Mark 15, verse 11. It may be that those within the crowd were paid operatives planted by the Sanhedrin. Whatever the case, the multitudes that admired Jesus were seemingly unaware of the legal proceedings against him and his impending execution. Pilate was amazed that Jesus refused to answer the false allegations from the chief priests, Matthew 27:12-14. He knew that the charges were motivated by envy among the chief priests, Matthew 27, verse 18. In spite of this, Pilate still interrogated Jesus as to whether he had intentions of insurrection. From John's Gospel, chapter 18. So Pilate went back into the governor's residence, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or have others told you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own people and your chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus replied, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my servants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish authorities. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Then Pilate said, "So you are a king?" Jesus replied, "You say that I am a king. For this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked, "What is truth?" When he had said this, he went back outside to the Jewish leaders and announced, "I find no basis for an accusation against him." End quote. John 18:33-38. Jesus expressly stated to Pilate that he was a king, but in an otherworldly sense. Romans were superstitious and intensely religious. Pilate would have understood their conversation from a religious and philosophical perspective. He even responded to Jesus in rhetorical language, ending their conversation by saying, "What is truth?" Pilate then announced to the crowd, quote, "I find no basis for an accusation against him," end quote. Pilate's wife had nightmares about Pilate's dealings with Jesus and asked him to recuse himself from the case, Matthew 27, verse 19. Whether Pilate was motivated by superstition or desires for ethical adjudication, he sought to release Jesus. Even though he knew Jesus was innocent, Pilate was a shrewd and practical politician whose actions were calculated. Political expediency would ultimately rule the day. It is noteworthy that neither Pilate, Caiaphas, nor the Sanhedrin dealt with Jesus as if he were a lunatic. To Caiaphas and the chief priests, Jesus represented a threat to their way of life. They also envied his popularity. Pilate recognized Jesus was an innocent man, and the Jewish leaders were motivated by jealousy. Pilate talks to the crowd. The voices in the crowd repeated charges that Jesus was a political insurgent. Furthermore, they threatened Pilate that releasing Jesus would be an act of disloyalty to Caesar. From John's Gospel, chapter 19, quote, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jewish leaders shouted out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." End quote. John 19, verse 12. Pilate was unwilling to risk potential allegations of disloyalty to Caesar. He was cornered. Pilate washes his hands. A macabre dialogue then takes place between Pilate and those in the crowd. Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus who is called the Christ?" They all said, "Crucify him." He asked, "Why? What wrong has he done?" But they shouted more insistently, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but that instead a riot was starting, he took some water, washed his hands before the crowd, and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. You take care of it yourselves." In reply, all the people said, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." End quote. Matthew 27, 22-25. Washing of hands to signify relinquishing responsibility was not a Roman custom. The symbolism harkens to Jewish law, with implications clearly understood by the crowd driving the agenda that morning. In Jewish law, when an unsolved murder occurred, an animal sacrifice and prayer of atonement had to be made. The elders of the closest nearby city would perform the ceremony, which included killing a heifer by breaking its neck. The elders of the city then washed their hands over the sacrificial animal. A pronouncement of innocence and plea for forgiveness completed the ceremony. From Deuteronomy chapter 21, "And all the elders of that city nearest the corpse must wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was sacrificially broken in the valley. Then they must proclaim, 'Our hands have not spilled this blood, nor have we witnessed the crime.'" Do not blame your people Israel whom you redeemed, O Lord, and do not hold them accountable for the bloodshed of an innocent person. Then atonement will be made for the bloodshed. In this manner you will purge out the guilt of innocent blood from among you, for you must do what is right before the Lord. Deuteronomy 21:6-9. By washing his hands, Pilate indicted the crowd for the murder of Jesus. Pilate reiterated this directly by stating, "I am innocent of this man's blood," Matthew 27, verse 24. Pilate's reference to Hebrew law was fully understood by the Jewish audience. The response from the crowd can be understood in a legal context. They accepted Pilate's statement of innocence and accepted upon themselves the responsibility or the blood guilt for Jesus' death. In reply, all the people said, "Let his blood be on us and on our children," Matthew 27, verse 25. The titulus crucis. Every person crucified had a plaque, the titulus crucis, Latin for title of the cross, affixed to the cross, stating the crimes for which they were being executed. Pilate ordered that the plaque state Jesus' crime was being, quote, "the King of the Jews," end quote, written in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. From John's Gospel, Pilate also had a notice written and fastened to the cross, which read, quote, "Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews," end quote. Thus many of the Jewish residents of Jerusalem read this notice because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the notice was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. Then the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write, 'the King of the Jews,' but rather, 'This man said, I am King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." John 19:19-22. Pilate's anger was palpable. The titulus crucis was Pilate's final snub to the Sanhedrin. In summary, Jesus' crucifixion was the culmination of a murder plot devised by Caiaphas and the chief priests of the Sanhedrin. It was driven by jealousy and the perceived threat that Jesus' popularity could incite a Roman police state and undo their way of life. If the Romans implemented martial law, they might also seize Herod's temple. Seizure of the temple would be a national financial catastrophe. Unwilling to kill Jesus themselves for fear of public outrage, Jewish leaders were able to successfully entangle Pontius Pilate in their murder plot and manipulate him into executing Jesus on trumped-up charges of sedition against Rome.